following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
And if you're on the other side, if you're trying to index this data, of course, it's so much easier to use an existing platform as a protocol like the graph instead of trying to roll your own indexer or trying to wire up a database and comb through event logs and stuff like that. There's been so much time and effort that's already gone into making sure this is a robust tool and an easy tool to develop on, that it just saves so much time that developers would spend otherwise building their own.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time, lost between past and future.
That is the sound of inevitable.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with David Mihal, a blockchain engineer who's worked on several well-known projects in the crypto space, including Crypto Fees and CryptoStats. David also has done some early work on burner wallets, often used at industry events, and some cool projects for both the Ethereum Foundation and Maker Foundation. I'm speaking with David today about his newest projects that relates to Subgraphs at the Graph. We also talk about his background in Web 2, his experiences as a digital nomad, his grant work with the Graph Foundation, and a lot more. As always, we started the discussion by talking about David's educational background.
So my educational background is, studied computer science at a school called WPI in Massachusetts. I kind of did a bunch of internships and hung around the Boston startup scene in college. But afterwards, I went and joined Google in New York City, and didn't spend too much time there. To be honest, it's a really interesting place to work, but the corporate culture is really just not. It's not my vibe. The types of work and the types of people that were there, wasn't the type of place that I saw myself sticking around for a while. So after a little bit, I left Google, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do at the time. And so I figured if I don't know what I want to do, I might as well just kind of go see the world, travel for a bit. So yeah, I left and kind of started traveling full time. Not too long into that journey, I needed to start making some money. So I started doing freelance development work, and spent a few years just traveling around, freelancing, seeing the world.
Well, I have a lot of questions about some of that background there. Certainly want to talk to you about your time at Google and learn more about your freelance work. But before we do, we were talking before we pushed record that you're currently located in Lisbon, Portugal. So you've moved from the East Coast of the United States to Lisbon. And I'm curious about the influx of people moving into this part of the world. What is the draw for you to Lisbon, and what's going on there as it relates to crypto?
Yeah, I mean, the story of Lisbon's been interesting. As I mentioned, I was traveling around a lot, and I kind of realized, I need to settle down, and started trying to think of which cities I wanted to settle in. I'd visited Lisbon a few times. It's a beautiful city. It's got nice weather. It's got a lot of interesting people. And so Lisbon was high on my list. But on the other hand, I was looking at Berlin, and, Berlin seemed to have all the interesting crypto people there. And, on one hand, I want to be in this place that seems like it has really good quality of life and interesting people. On the other hand, I want to be around the people that are interested in the same things I'm interested in, which is crypto, and those are in Berlin. I ended up going to Lisbon. I kind of moved here full time, early into COVID. When COVID hit, I was actually in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And that was an interesting experience to be there when COVID hit. We talk a lot in crypto about, inflation and fiat money and stuff like that. Between March and June 2020, that was the time that I spent in Buenos Aires. The Argentine peso dropped, I want to say almost 50%. It went from, I think maybe 70 pesos per dollar to 125 pesos per dollar. So that was kind of crazy to get to live through that in real life. It worked out well for me as someone who has my money in dollars and stable coins and stuff like that. But I had to buy Argentine pesos to get by. And I had friends that were texting me whenever they got paid. They're like, "Hey, David, I just got paid in pesos. Do you want to buy any pesos from me?" Because they're all trying to get rid of their pesos and get dollars. So that was just an interesting time to be in that place. So after a few months in Argentina, I said like I kind of already knew that Lisbon was where I wanted to spend time, where I wanted to kind of start making my home. So managed to make my way over to Lisbon. It was tough to travel in 2020, as I'm sure people remember, especially with the US passport. But yeah, I made it to Lisbon and kind of have been here mostly ever since. But the interesting thing was in 2021, I guess right after like the second lockdown ended, I came out of the lockdown and there was like the first big crypto meetup in Lisbon after lockdowns. Lisbon's always had like some small crypto meetups going on. But in this first one in like May 2021, I went there and I realized like so many people had moved to Lisbon in such a short period of time. My friends from Berlin, from London, from the US, like everyone just seemed to be descending on Portugal, which again kind of worked out well for me. I'm glad I didn't move to Berlin because, the Berlin came to me here in Portugal. So, I mean, a lot of it is, taxes are definitely a big motivator. If you're, I guess, anyone except for American, like there's pretty great tax benefits to being in Portugal, especially if you hold crypto. But, I think aside from the tax side of thing, it's just a place that it's got a lot of like bright people from around the world coming here. And the way I see it is it feels like a bit of like a blank canvas. Like this isn't like New York, which has a history of finance, London that has a history of finance, the Bay Area that has a history of technology. Like, Portugal hasn't had a strong like technology scene until somewhat recently. And I think there's a really huge opportunity for, all these interesting Web3 people coming here to kind of make Portugal and make Lisbon really like a hub of Europe for this new technology and this new world that we want to build. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm glad. It was cool to kind of be here a little bit before everybody else and front run that a bit.
David, I'm starting to learn new terms myself. The more people I interview and the more I get involved in Web3, I'm learning these things. And one of them is digital nomad, right? And so I don't really understand fully kind of what a digital nomad is. And are you a digital nomad? Is that kind of how you see yourself?
I'd kind of say I'm like a former nomad at this point, or a retired nomad. For about 4 years, I was, had no permanent accommodations. I was living out of a backpack, staying in Airbnbs and hostels, guest houses, sleeping on friends' couches and, just kind of working wherever. So I think for those 4 years, I was like a proper digital nomad. Again, I've settled down a bit in Lisbon here. I still, of course, travel. I'm heading off to Colombia for DevCon. So I'll be kind of going back into nomad mode for that. But yeah, for the most part, the permanent travel is behind me. But the interesting thing in crypto is it seems like a really common lifestyle in crypto, or at least compared to other industries. I remember being at a crypto conference a couple of years ago, and I was making small talk with a group of people. And, usually you're making small talk, you say, where do you live? But I kind of got the feeling that these people might have also been nomads. So to the 4 people I was with, I just said, you guys live anywhere? And they all just went, no. It was like this group of people from around the world. None of them had any like permanent base. They were just kind of traveling around, going to the crypto conferences, to, interesting places, things like that.
In all your travels, you've seen a lot of different cities. You've met a lot of different people. What's the one city you would recommend everybody who listens to this podcast should visit? Everybody should put on your bucket list to go where?
It's a great question. I mean, Lisbon is certainly, it's the one that I've decided to make my home in. I think it's one of the best places to stay long term. It's, again, good weather. It's safe, beautiful, good people. But the other place that kind of has a strong hold in my heart is Medellin, Colombia. As I mentioned, I'm really excited to head back to Colombia in a couple of weeks ahead of DevCon. But, that's just the place that I think has a different energy than anywhere else I've been in the world. It's exciting. It's there's a lot going on there. There is a growing crypto scene there, but there's just also, good music, good food, interesting people, also a lot of digital nomads. But Colombians are just some of like the nicest, most welcoming people you'll ever meet. So that's a big part of it too. Yeah, Medellin's a great spot. Can't wait to go back.
Let's talk a little bit about your time back in Web 2. As you were introducing yourself, you talked about some time at Google, and anybody that kind of looks you up and sees your professional history will see you also spent time at other well-known brands in Web 2. You mentioned that it didn't really line up at Google per se with your own ethics and what you want to do with your own career. How would you describe kind of that Web 2 space? And I'd be curious also to know, How do you think these firms like Google will respond to what's happening in Web3 and crypto?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned like ethics, because at the time, my issues with working there weren't really anything ethical. I think nowadays they would be. Now, nowadays that might be a high reason why I wouldn't work in that industry, is that I think some of these companies are net negatives on the world. At the time, it was more, especially some of these really big companies, they're so big, they have so many people, you end up working on very small incremental changes. And even the small ones, even startups, it seemed like a lot of startups are looking for very narrow like niches of ways that they can extract a little bit of value somewhere in like the SaaS pipeline or the consumer app pipelines. So yeah, that working in that type of thing didn't appeal to me. So when I kind of discovered Web3, it seemed like there was just so much more value that could be created, so much more opportunities to really have like a strong impact on the world that I didn't see in the Web2 space.
Do you think this Web2, Web3, do you think it really is kind of a zero-sum game, Web3 wins or Web2 wins? Or is there this future where they coexist?
For sure, I think they'll coexist. Chris Dixon's talked about the idea of like skeuomorphism, the idea that new technology, like lots of people will try to replicate the old technology, which I think the good examples are like early computers or early internet. There was like digital magazines where you would like drag to turn the page, or digital encyclopedias where they just uploaded the encyclopedia. And the actual digital magazine is Instagram. The actual digital encyclopedia is Wikipedia. So the things that are actually like take the most advantage of a new technology are things that couldn't have even been built on the old technology. And I really think that's true of kind of Web3 as well. Like I don't think Web3 is going to make like a new Google and a new Facebook and things like that. It's more that there will be new things. We're seeing that like NFTs have a very social component to it. And, you're seeing like, I think just today, like Facebook and Instagram are like integrating NFTs more. So I don't think it's going to be a competition. I don't think there's going to be Web3 like alternatives to most of these big Web2 things. We'll probably see some synergies, like I mentioned, the Facebook, Instagram, NFT thing, maybe some competition. But I think, ultimately, like they will be symbiotic at some point. Maybe we steal a lot of like the great developers over to Web3 because we're more interested in doing more fun stuff. But, I don't think it's like a competition at the product level.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ. I just wanted to thank you for listening to this episode and supporting the podcast. Each week, the GRTIQ podcast shines a light on the people working to build Web3 and the graph. Guests of the podcast come here to share their stories, their insights, and what they've learned along the way, hoping that you might find something useful or inspiring as you write your own story. Please join other listeners who have supported this podcast by leaving a review or a rating wherever you listen to the podcast, by following GRTIQ on Twitter, or by sharing something you learned from this episode with a colleague or friend. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for your support. Roger that.
When you moved out of Web2, you started a career as a freelancer. We're going to talk a little bit about the projects you've been working on and some of the work you've been doing. But during your time in Web3, you've worked for Ethereum Foundation, you've done work for Maker Foundation. I'd be curious to know what you've been doing with those groups and some of the projects you've contributed.
Yeah, so since I've kind of gotten into the Web3 crypto space, I've worked on a lot of different projects. I've worked on a lot of interesting grants. The most interesting one out of the ones you mentioned was probably the Maker Foundation funded a bunch of grant projects that we did back a few years ago. I guess anybody who's been in the Ethereum space for a few years might remember burner wallets. This was a really cool thing back in like 2019. I guess I first experienced a burner wallet when I attended ETH Denver 2019. And the idea of burner wallet is it's just this, it's a crypto wallet, but it's one that runs in your browser. Your private key is in local storage, although they don't, as a user, you don't even need to be aware of that. The idea is it's just like the easiest possible way to use like a wallet. You scan a QR code, like a paper QR code, and it pops open this wallet. So when every attendee showed up at ETH Denver in 2019, they could scan a QR code. It would open a wallet right in their web browser, and they would already have some tokens in there. And you could go spend them in the food trucks. You could, some of the sponsors were taking them for like swag. There were some happy hours where you could spend these tokens on like drinks and stuff like that. And, I just kind of fell in love with this idea. So I was kind of following the development of it. Of course, these were built by Austin Griffith, who's a very well-known like builder and educator in the space and just an overall like amazing person. So I started kind of like hanging out in this Telegram chat with him and a bunch of other people and, started building like newer versions of the burner wallet and other stuff around that. I built something called the Burner Factory, which the idea was to make it so that anybody could build like a custom burner wallet for their event. And we started doing like all sorts of burner events, which people often would confuse with like Burning Man type parties. But these were burner wallet parties where we would, give people a bunch of, tokens in their burner wallets, let them pay for beers, whatever. And it just was the best way to onboard new users to Web3. Like my favorite part was just seeing someone who like hasn't really used crypto before, like see their face light up when they're like, wow, I have like $10 on my phone and I haven't even typed in my email address to anything. And so, we did it everything from, these big hackathons like ETH Denver and ETH Waterloo to small, like little happy hours. I did like a 15-person event in Medellin, Colombia, where we just kind of bought everybody a bunch of beers and told them about DeFi and let them pay with their burner wallets on their phones. So, to tie that back, the Maker Foundation was really supportive of that whole project. They funded a bunch of grants around it because, we were getting people to like put DAI on their phone and to see how cool it was. They could have $10, pay for a beer with it. And again, like you don't even need to type in your email address to use it.
Are people still using burner wallets?
I don't think they're used quite as much. I think the idea has really stuck around. Like there's still some people that are using it. Sometimes you'll log into a dApp and there'll be a mode like burner wallet mode where it's kind of like, if you just want to try out the app without like connecting your MetaMask and wallet and everything, they'll go to like burner wallet mode. But for me personally, my work on it kind of, I kind of transitioned away from it when COVID hit because, we had all these plans for all these really cool things we were going to do at in-person events. And then COVID hit and it was like, there's not going to be any hackathons. There's not going to be any conferences. There's not going to be any just bar meetups. So, it kind of stopped putting quite as much energy into it there. But I think the idea still lives on. And I hope people keep doing burner wallet events. If anyone that's listening runs a crypto meetup in their town, this is a really cool, like engaging way to get people actually using crypto and kind of seeing like how this can work in real life.
When I have the opportunity to speak with someone like you, a younger person who has had time in Web 2 to work at notable firms, a firm like Google, but you eventually escape and you leave and you go to work in Web 3. I want to understand what pulls people like you out of Web 2 and into the Web 3 space, and particularly as it relates to blockchain. Why are you passionate or interested about blockchain? What pulled you into that?
Yeah, so the original thing that got me into blockchain was really just how much impact you can have on the world with this technology. So I was saying like, at a lot of kind of Web 2 companies, the work you're doing is, incremental tweaks to the user interface or adding some new, very small features to some SaaS product. And in Web 3, you can redesign like the incentive systems of the world. You can, redesign money. You can change the way commerce works. You can change the way art works, in NFTs. You can do it with like relatively small pieces of code. So the amount of impact you have is just massive. And that was the thing that really like originally got me so excited about it was seeing that much impact and seeing that this was still like very early days for this technology. It's like, it felt like it was the 90s of the internet. Most of the big web companies today started in the 90s, early 2000s. And, I think we're still like maybe in that time period for Web 3. Like if you want to make an impact, now's the time you can kind of get in at the ground floor and build some of these really great projects that I'm sure are going to be massive in the future.
there's no way blockchain goes away, right? This is really something with a lot of utility that the world is slowly but surely going to adopt. Is that what you think about it?
I mean, the only way blockchain goes away is if there's something better. We're not going back to kind of like the centralized, one massive server owned by Facebook, one massive server owned by Google. If somebody builds a better system for kind of decentralized, trustless ledgers, then we'll use that. Blockchain is just kind of a technology at the end of the day, but the technology can't be uninvented. So yeah, this direction we're moving in, I can't imagine it slowing down.
You must have friends or family that aren't totally familiar with Web3, crypto, and blockchain. I'd be curious how you describe or help educate people about what fundamentally a blockchain is for people that are non-technical.
Yeah, it's a really tough to try to explain something so technical as a blockchain. I think a lot of people get hung up on like the technical details of it. I remember trying to explain blockchain to some friends once, and I was going into like double spend problems and proof of work, and my friend's eyes just glossed over. So when you explain to people that aren't in the space, I think the focus really has to be on kind of what is the impact to the end user. And if you're trying to explain like the blockchain itself, the technology, the focus needs to be on how does it change the real world? How does it change like applications in the real world? And to me, like the fundamental thing that makes blockchain so useful, a lot of people would say decentralization, but I think decentralization that's a very like blockchain word. Most people don't know what decentralization is. It's almost kind of like a cliche to say decentralization. A better word to me is disintermediation. It's removing middlemen from any operation. So, for basic like economic uses of blockchains, the old world, you need to kind of use a bank or some payment processor if you want to pay people. Blockchains disintermediate that idea. They let you send money directly from one person to another. In the traditional world with, say, domain names, you have to, buy your domain name from some domain name company, and you need to, store it with some company. And there's essentially governments that are kind of running these domain name systems. With blockchains, you have something like ENS. It's just a smart contract that you kind of buy your domain name from. You can do whatever you want with it. I can give examples all day, kind of Uniswap, you could say disintermediates things like NASDAQ and Coinbase. But yeah, just in general, that's like the real value of these technologies. And, going forward, I think we find more and more complex systems that we can disintermediate, more ingrained like middlemen that we can kind of find ways to remove from the picture with this technology. And that idea is, I think, something that normal people can understand. Normal people know, like they hate dealing with middlemen. They hate dealing with, bureaucracy. And that's like, I think, the most tangible value that people can understand about blockchain.
As a follow-up, I would be curious to know how you describe what a blockchain engineer is. When I looked at your bio, you obviously are one, right? And spend your time doing that type of work. So what is a blockchain engineer? What do they do?
Yeah, I'd say a blockchain engineer is not too different than any other software engineer. Your goal is to kind of understand problems, find out the right ways to solve those problems, like kind of the most elegant solutions to these technical problems, and to implement it. And even like a lot of the tools, I think people would be surprised that a lot of it's not that different than traditional web technologies. Front ends are mostly built with your usual web technologies, with React, with everything else. Our smart contracts are written in Solidity, which is roughly derived from JavaScript, things like that. Subgraphs are built with assembly script, which is basically TypeScript. The part that is different is, I think, there's a lot of different mindsets to being in blockchain. I guess one really simple example is in traditional programming, where when you go to university and you study computer science, you spend a lot of time learning how to optimize computer programs to be fast. Because for most of computing history, it was like, how can we make things faster? How can we make our programs go really, really fast? When you're building smart contracts, you're trying to optimize for cost. You have different resources. So you're trying to say, like, how do I make my smart contract execute with fees that are as low as possible? Not really speed. It's how do I not like store data, because storing is really expensive. I just wrote a blog post about layer 2s. Now call data is really expensive on layer 2s. So you need to kind of think about these different resources a little bit differently. And, I think the best way to understand that's just sometimes just to use these technologies a lot. Like anybody who's used Ethereum gets a sense of, some transactions are expensive. If I I do a Uniswap trade, it's a bit more expensive than a token transfer. And if I open a maker vault, that's more expensive than any of those other things. So just using like dApps gives you a sense of kind of the problem space that we're working with. And I guess if any developer is like trying to get into the Web3 space, that's would be my biggest advice is just try everything, use a lot. Don't put too much money into things, but the best way to learn is just to use these tools and understand like what are the applications we're building, what are the problems we're solving.
As a non-technical guy myself, trying to understand L2s and like you said, the cost implications of transacting on blockchain and smart contracts, are L2s the thing that bring costs down all across crypto? These are the gateway into lower transaction costs? I mean, or is there some other like utility and value here that listeners might find interesting to know about?
So certainly like layer twos are one of the like most promising technologies to bring transaction fees down. I'm super excited about the layer two space. It's one of the areas I'm most interested. But a little more broadly, I think the way to think about it is a transition from this idea of like monolithic blockchains, which is kind of every blockchain that we've known since the invention of Bitcoin, to a more modular stack. Blockchains have a lot of different tasks, a lot of different resources to allocate and manage. And by kind of breaking that stack apart, we can optimize each cost differently. So, with layer twos on Ethereum, the idea is that these layer twos can execute really fast. They can have different execution properties, but still rely on Ethereum for Ethereum's properties, which is like high censorship resistance, high security, things like that. So, Ethereum and layer twos have already kind of split the stack into two pieces. Moving forward, I think we're going to see even more, modularization. There's projects like Celestia that are blockchains just for what we call data availability, like kind of like data storage. I won't go down that rabbit hole. We're seeing things like the Cosmos ecosystem, which is an ecosystem that is also super cool. They just have lots of independent, heterogeneous blockchains, and they're doing things with shared security, shared validator sets, things like that, and communication between those. So, yeah, the move from kind of these monolithic blockchains, like Ethereum is today, or at least was like a year ago, to this modular future where we have layer twos, layer threes, Cosmos zones, bridges between all of them. That's kind of, I think, what really like brings the cost down and makes blockchains honestly a lot more interesting.
If you had to just guess where we're at in that process, right, of creating this layer 2, layer 3 environment that you just described, has it even started yet? Are we in the very early days, or are we a little bit more progressive on these types of things?
It's definitely the early days for this transition. If you look at the consensus narrative, like a lot of people don't even really know about layer twos. I built a website called l2fees.info to show people that a lot of people were saying, oh, Ethereum's so expensive. And people didn't even know that there was something that is still Ethereum that has low fees. You can send transactions for just a few pennies on most of these layer twos. So lots of people don't even know that layer twos exist. And to be fair, they've only really existed for about a year. I think Arbitrum 1 publicly launched about a year ago, and that was kind of the first general purpose layer 2. And we still haven't even seen like the start of like the ZK rollup or the zero knowledge revolution, I think. There are zero knowledge rollups today, but this technology is still like really, really young. There's still like, this is the cutting edge of research in blockchains. It's like zero knowledge proofs, zero knowledge rollups, things like that. So, I think it's going to be a number of years before that technology like really matures to the point that it reaches its full potential. And, once we get to that point, that's going to be really exciting because the amount that we can do with blockchain is going to be massive. This is like moving from dial-up to broadband. Think of how many things we do on the internet today that weren't possible on those 52K modems.
Well, it's incredible, and it's an exciting time. And I, too, am still learning about L2 and L3 myself, and your answers have been very educational for me. Another thing that I'm still wrapping my mind around, and again, as a non-technical person, smart contracts are sometimes hard to understand. Why you need a smart contract engineer, what these smart contracts do. What can you share with listeners that are like me, who are still trying to figure out what a smart contract is?
I think the easiest way to explain a smart contract is it's like a vending machine. you go to a vending machine and there's only like so many things a vending machine can do. You put in money and you press the candy you want, and the happy case is it gives you your candy and gives you a little bit of change, and then you're done. Or maybe you didn't put enough money in, so then maybe it gives you the money back because it can't give you your candy. Or again, if you give the exact amount, it just gives the candy. If you give too much, it's going to give you some change. So a smart contract's kind of like that. With Uniswap, you give it some tokens and it gives you back some other tokens. If you don't give Uniswap enough tokens, it's just going to give you back the tokens that you originally gave it. The part about smart contracts that is really interesting is the immutability. This is kind of one of these properties that we can only have with blockchains. You can't build applications that are immutable with kind of previous technologies. So the immutability gives you a lot of different benefits. For a user, exactly what this smart contract will do. So I know Uniswap, if Uniswap was safe yesterday, like Uniswap is going to be safe. It's going to do exactly what I want it to do tomorrow. I know that nobody can kind of go in there and they can like switch out the code and steal my money or something like that. But I think even more importantly is to an application developer, this immutability means if you want to build on top of somebody else's protocol, somebody else's application, if you know that protocol is immutable, then you have a really high assurance that you have a strong foundation to build on top of. The example of how this could go poorly in Web 2 is there used to be like this thriving ecosystem of Twitter apps back in the day before Twitter had their own app, because Twitter had an open API. So people were building really cool Twitter apps. And then one day Twitter was like, well, why are we letting all these other companies get value off of our platform, with their apps when we could have our own app and, we could push ads to users, things like that. So they made their own app and then they like basically got rid of their API, and anybody who built their business around like having the best Twitter app, they were out of business all of a sudden. So the immutability of smart contracts like lets you know that that's not going to happen. If you try to build like a Twitter clone on some open social network protocol, maybe something with like Lens protocol, something like that, that this protocol is not going to get changed from underneath you, that the CEO of some company is not just going to turn off your access. And that's what's led to, in DeFi, we've seen really interesting things with composability, that there's all these protocols that are stacked on top of each other that take advantage of each other. And this is really like counter to what we see in Web 2. Web 2 is all about building walls. You've got Google that's got like a million different applications and they're all integrated with each other, but there's a wall around them. It's very hard for outside developers to interact. And then Facebook has their own walled garden and Microsoft has their own walled garden and Apple. But yeah, in crypto, like everyone's just building on top of each other because these protocols are open. They're, mostly immutable. So that has led to this Cambrian growth of, at least in the DeFi space. And now like imagine as scaling technology gets better, once we see blockchains used for more than just DeFi, we're going to see that like that interoperability, that composability, like how that can benefit like all these other industries. And I'm really excited to see that.
Hey, this is David Mihal with CryptoStats. If my conversation with the GRTIQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
GRTIQ podcast.
Thanks for listening.
Roger that.
I want to go back to something we talked about as it relates to blockchain. And this has come up on the podcast before, and I'd love to take the opportunity to ask you about it and get your ideas. But I understand that blockchains are fundamentally designed to be written to, but not necessarily read from. And so I don't know if this is the read-write problem or how it can be best characterized. But as a blockchain engineer, as somebody with your depth of experience, is that right? Am I thinking about that correctly? Is there a fundamental issue here with blockchains such that they're intended to be written to, but not necessarily read?
It's a fascinating question. And I think it actually goes against a lot of the way people have thought about blockchains since say like Ethereum was created. When Ethereum was launched, it was like marketed as this world computer. And what can you do with a computer? You can read to it, you can write to it, you can do whatever you want with it. So people, I think, really imagined that, Ethereum would be, you could write programs the same way you write programs for any computer or website. And it's like, as we've run into these scaling problems that we've had to kind of rethink, like, okay, like what is a blockchain good at? Like what is the minimum that I need to do with this blockchain? And, as you mentioned, this idea that a blockchain should only be written to and not read, that's kind of an important feature to really scale blockchains. Blockchains are very slow. They're like these very slow, inefficient computers. They're very resource constrained. So one way you can optimize the resources you have is to not do all the computation that we're using chains like Ethereum for on the chain itself, but to move those somewhere else. Like a funny example is you could actually build a token that isn't like a traditional ERC20 token on chain. You can have a token that only emits events in an Ethereum smart contract, and then have something like the Graph protocol read those events and like reconstruct the token state. And you've now made a token that's much cheaper to transfer to do anything with than an existing ERC20 token. Now, of course, it won't work in any DeFi applications. It won't work, in all the places you expect it. But that idea is kind of the same idea as rollups. Rollups are essentially just posting data to Ethereum and doing as little execution on Ethereum as possible. They're using like the layer 2 to kind of execute the transactions, keep track of token balances. So yeah, I think that's going to be the direction that more and more blockchains move towards is separating these concerns, where the core blockchain is just a really simple like bulletin board where transactions get posted. Transactions might not even get validated aside from paying a small fee. And then you have a rollup, you have a subgraph, you have these other kind of environments that are somewhere else that are actually doing like the more complex stuff.
I appreciate that answer. It certainly helps resolve some of these topics in my own mind. And I want to now turn our attention a little bit to the projects you're working on, and particularly as it relates to the graph. And you're doing a lot of really cool stuff, and I'm excited to shine a light on some of the tooling that CryptoStats and the team there have been working on. Before I ask you some of those questions, I always like to know when someone became aware of the graph and what their first impressions were. Do you remember yours?
Yeah, I mean, I've been aware of it for a while, just kind of from coming to hackathons and everything. But the first time I really started using it was when I built, well, the thing that I'm probably most known for these days is a website called cryptofeeds.info, which is a very simple little dashboard info site that shows fee revenue for various crypto protocols. And I first built that site back in like the early days of DeFi summer, when DeFi was just starting to take off for the first time. Uniswap was starting to see a lot of volume flowing through. There were all these new tokens that you could only get in DeFi. You couldn't really get them on centralized exchanges yet. And people started talking that the amount of fee revenue that Uniswap was making was comparable to Bitcoin and Ethereum. And I threw together this really simple little website that kind of basically showed layer 1 blockchains, Bitcoin, Ethereum, other smaller chains like Bitcoin Cash and Ethereum Classic and Ripple and all these other chains. And it had Uniswap v1 and Uniswap v2. And for each of those, it showed how much fees are paid to that protocol in one day. So for blockchains, that's a transaction fee. And for Uniswap, for decentralized exchanges, that's a trading fee that goes to the liquidity provider. And so to build that site, I used a project called Coinmetrics to get like the Ethereum and the Bitcoin, those fees. But for Uniswap fees, I had to use this thing called a subgraph. So I was diving into the Uniswap subgraph and figuring out how to get the fee data from there. And then I shared this site on Twitter, and it got way bigger like response than I expected. People really interested in it, probably because I think it was one of the first like fundamentals based websites for DeFi and crypto. And as people were really excited about it, they kept saying, "Oh, can you add this protocol to it? Can you add synthetics? Can you add balancer?" And like, okay, like synthetics, they have a subgraph too. I can get the fee data from there, and I think balancer did as well. But at some point, I started running into protocols that didn't have a subgraph, or they had a subgraph but it didn't have their fee revenue data. So I was like, okay, now I gotta learn how to fetch this data myself, how to index this data. So that's kind of as I went down the rabbit hole of building subgraphs, just trying to like get data to feed into these sites, trying to get the data that people were asking me for. And, as a programmer, I just thought the idea of building these indexers was really fun and really elegant. And so I started enjoying it more and more. And using it for projects outside of CryptoFees and CryptoStats. But yeah, that was my journey down the rabbit hole into the graph ecosystem.
And CryptoFees is still active. You can still go online and take a look at that original work. So it's got some staying power, right?
Absolutely. So yeah, after running that as a side project for a bit, I started putting a bit more time into it. Not the site itself specifically. Anyone will see that the site still looks a lot like it did 2 years ago when it launched. But by running the site, we started realizing a lot of the challenges in this like data ecosystem. On one hand, we were dealing with all these projects that were coming to us asking to get listed on the site, saying, how do we get listed? How do we get our data there? And on the other hand, people were coming to us because we had like the best fee revenue data. And they're saying, do you have an API? We want to use this data on our own websites. Can we have access to it? And it was coming from, one of the first projects, if you want to call it that, to come to us was Bloomberg. And so I was going, wow, like there's a huge demand for this data. And there's also a huge demand to like put the data into this system. So that's when we started this project called CryptoStats. And the idea of this is to be like one source for all data in the crypto ecosystem. And so the primary way that we were addressing this issue of making sure that like anybody can have access to like good, trustworthy data was to build adapters. And I see adapters as like being this small layer of this like data pipeline, essentially, where data starts on, the data source, which is like the blockchain. This is, your transactions, your transaction events, like just the raw data. And then it goes through the indexing later. This is like, I think ETL is the technical term. And this is where things like the graph come in. This is where you're ingesting large amounts of data and you're transforming it, you're doing computations, and you're like loading a large database of indexed data. The next thing you need some way to pick data from all these different subgraphs, from all these different protocols, and put it in like one ordered data set. So that's where we came in, is we built this protocol for building adapters, which are just small little snippets of TypeScript that pull data from subgraphs. We'll pull it from other data sources, pull pricing data from CoinGecko, put this data into a bunch of queries that all kind of have the same format. So if you want to get fee revenue for all, 40 protocols or whatever we list, you can just run it against all these adapters, and the adapters will pull from subgraphs, pull from whatever data source is necessary, and give you like a nice, easy to use output. And then I guess the final layer of this data stack would be the presentation layer. So that's the websites like Cryptofeeds, like DeFi Llama, like L2Beat, even things like Bloomberg or any like centralized, closed source website. These are all sites that are taking data and figuring out how to best present it to users. So our goal is to make sure that those presentation layer projects have all the data that they need. Like if someone's like a really good data visualization person, they don't need to worry about like getting data from all these different projects. They can just come to us, we'll give them the data, and they can focus on putting that data into a format that lets end users understand it. So that's the current state of CryptoStats and how CryptoFees launched that project.
So a lot of the tooling that you're talking about here, as it comes to adapters and using subgraphs, does relate to subgraphs in the graph ecosystem. So can you describe in greater detail some of the tooling that you're developing at CryptoStats?
Yeah, so the first tool we built was this browser-based editor. We wanted to make sure that anybody could build these adapters for CryptoStats really easily without having to go on their command line and open up an editor and stuff. Because we were thinking of it kind of like Wikipedia. Wikipedia is great because anybody can come, they can edit Wikipedia. You do have to kind of understand like Markdown or whatever templating language they use. But for the most part, it's easy enough that anybody can make their updates. So we wanted to make sure that anybody could come to CryptoStats and they could look at the code for one of the adapters. And if they saw an improvement they could make, if they saw something wrong, they could just click edit, make their small change and submit that edit for review. So we built this really cool like browser-based tool. Feels like an IDE. Feels kind of like VS Code. You can test adapters there. You can do a lot of cool stuff, and you can publish them right to IPFS from there. So we've gotten really good feedback on that editor. So, after we kind of finished that and we're kind of looking to how can we continue to make it easier for anybody to contribute to this like open data ecosystem, the next layer of that data pipe to address was, going down the stack to the indexing layer. And that's protocols like the graph. So we decided to kind of take this browser-based editor that we'd already built and see if we can modify it to also let users build subgraphs. So this is something we've kind of spent the last couple of months building. I think hopefully when this podcast comes out, we'll have publicly launched our beta version of this subgraph editor. But yeah, what this editor offers is kind of the same thing we were offering for adapters. But so we're trying to lower the barrier of entry for any developer or any person, even if you're not a developer, to build a subgraph. Right now, you can kind of come to our subgraph editor and just insert a smart contract and start coding up your subgraph without needing to like fetch ABIs, without needing to write manifest files. You still do need to write your assembly script mapping file at this point in time. But of course, this is just the beginning of this project. Our goal is to, really to make it so that anybody can, use the graph and use these toolings to create data and contribute back to the ecosystem. We see that there's so much demand for people to get data about, what's happening on blockchains. We see all these people using tools like Dune Analytics and Flipside Crypto. And I mean, those are great tools. Like I use them myself, but there are also like kind of, Web 2 style projects. And what we're really trying to do is say that, the graph and CryptoStats and these other projects can be building blocks to like a Web 3 data ecosystem where someone can come in and they can build a subgraph to try to understand what's happening on a blockchain. And now that subgraph is like a public good that anybody can access to, anybody can take data from, anybody can build their own dashboards on top of it. So yeah, we're building tooling to kind of keep making that easier for anybody to contribute there.
Well, congratulations to you and the team. And of course, subgraph creation is a huge focus within the graph ecosystem right now, along with subgraph migration, migrating from the hosted service to the decentralized network. In relationship to your subgraph editor and some of the work you're doing there, I'd be curious how the team has corresponded with Messari, for example, the first core subgraph developer team added to the graph network, who are working and spending a lot of time on standardization. So how have you built that editor tool to kind of account for the Messari and the work they're doing?
Yeah, so we've been talking to Messari for a while since their kind of early days. And, I'll say I'm super impressed with the work they've been doing. Like these guys have been just cranking out subgraphs, which is amazing. And, their work on standardization, as someone who's like consuming a lot of data, their standardization just makes it so much easier for us to get the data because the subgraphs, they all look the same. They all have the same data fields and stuff. So where I think we can play in with that is this subgraph editor allows us to be a little bit more opinionated in terms of how we push developers to build their subgraphs. So one thing we plan on adding to the subgraph editor is the ability to start off with a template, which can be the, Messari standardized templates for, say, a decentralized exchange. That if you're building a subgraph for a DEX, it'll give you the Messari schema, maybe some helper functions, and let you start with a standardized subgraph instead of having to like figure out how to make your subgraph standards compliant. So I think that the subgraph editor can be like a really great tool to help Messari with their efforts to having like this great catalog of like standardized subgraphs for the whole ecosystem.
As a point of comparing or contrasting, listeners of the podcast and members of the graph ecosystem are familiar with the recent launch of Soulbound Studio, which Soulbound Labs created, which is this interesting interface for somebody who has no technical background to go in and generate subgraphs. How does your subgraph editor compare or contrast with what the team at Soulbound Labs is doing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the Soulbound editor is like super cool. I've played with it a bit, and they built like a really sleek experience. I think we have very similar goals. We're both trying to make it really easy for developers to kind of get started with building subgraphs. We're just kind of taking a little bit different approaches. We're starting with a little bit more focus on writing the assembly script mappings. And there, I think going for a very like kind of a no-code approach where you're just selecting contracts and connecting them together. So one area that I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration is we've been pushing for a lot more metadata to be included in subgraphs when they're published. So when you publish a subgraph using our subgraph editor, it first of all, you'll notice that it makes you sign a message with your MetaMask to publish it. So all of our subgraphs are signed by an account, which is really useful because, if you see a subgraph, you'll be able to see kind of who created that, like, maybe who was the ENS name associated with it. But additionally, we include all the source code in the subgraph manifest. This is something that if you see somebody's subgraph that's already published and you want to like kind of fork it and change it, you kind of have to hope that they've put that code on GitHub. A lot of projects do, but oftentimes it's out of date. Sometimes it's hard to find. What we're kind of trying to move towards is like, I guess, the equivalent of a verified smart contract on Etherscan, where you have like the bytecode of a smart contract that's running on the Ethereum blockchain, but there's also the Solidity source code that's right alongside it. So we want to put the assembly script source code for a subgraph right alongside the WASM bytecode that's actually being run. And what this would allow is for anybody to just see a subgraph, click edit, and they can open it in our editor, or they can open it in Soulbound's editor, or they can open it on their desktop computer or any other future tooling. So, I think this is one step to having like an ecosystem where all these tools can like work together really nicely, and where people can kind of collaborate on subgraphs using whatever tool they're most comfortable with.
Well, it seems to me that, you're 100% right. And I think a lot of people in the community have recognized that we need more developers to be building. But you're somebody who's got a lot of experience building, and you could probably shed a lot of insight as to why a developer would find using a subgraph so beneficial. So do you mind just taking a minute here and explaining how subgraphs make the life of developers easier?
Yeah. So, I think a lot of developers that are new to Web3 will find using a subgraph like very refreshing. Trying to get data from a blockchain can be kind of a difficult task. I was working on a lot of apps for a while where I, basically had to write my own indexer. I was having my Ethers or Web3.js kind of parsing through events and trying to like extract the data I was looking for. In Web2, you're used to be able to just hit an API and just ask for the data you want. And that's kind of what a subgraph gives you. If a subgraph's already there, is you can just say, I want to know how many trades did this token have on Uniswap on this day. And that data is, kind of nicely formatted. It's in GraphQL, which developers are used to, and very easily served to them. And if you're on the other side, if you're trying to index this data, of course, it's so much easier to use an existing platform as a protocol like the graph, instead of trying to like roll your own indexer, trying to like wire up a database and comb through event logs and stuff like that. There's been so much time and effort that's already gone into making sure this is like a robust tool and an easy tool to develop on, that it just saves so much time that developers would spend otherwise building their own.
David, I wanted to also ask you about the Graph Foundation grant program. It's my understanding that you received a grant early on for Cryptofeeds, but you're also received some support for the work you're currently doing with Subgraph Editor at CryptoStats. What's the background there?
Yeah, the Graph Foundation was just supportive of us in the early days. I guess, we've been power users of the Graph. Pretty much every protocol on Cryptofeeds, the data is coming from the Graph. And if it's not coming from the Graph, we probably would like to switch to the Graph when it's possible. So the Graph Foundation, they gave us some grants in the early days for Cryptofeeds. And then as we've worked to build the Subgraph editor, they've been really supportive of that initiative as well. So we're really grateful for that.
Well, again, the Subgraph editor you described sounds super interesting, and I'm sure will be very beneficial to a lot of developers out there. If listeners want to give it a try and kind of go to work on it and test it out, what's the best way to do it?
Yeah, if you go to CryptoStats.community, which is our site, there should be a link right on the homepage to open the Subgraph editor and get started. And if you have questions or need some help with it, again, this tool is still in beta. I'm sure there's still some bugs there, but we would love to know about those bugs so we can get them fixed. Come join our Discord. You can join the Discord by going to CryptoStats.community/Discord.
And I'll put those links in the show notes for any listener that wants to get their hands dirty and go try this out. So, David, now we've reached a part in the podcast where I'm going to ask you the GRT IQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each guest of the podcast every week to help listeners learn something new, try something different, or achieve more. So, are you ready for the GRT IQ 10?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
The GRT IQ 10.
This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
The one that's actually had the most impact in my life was probably a book called Vagabonding. And it's a book I read back when I was living in New York, back when I was thinking of traveling. And it was maybe one of the things that gave me the confidence to quit my job and go kind of be a homeless hacker for a few years. But aside from that, there was a book I read called The Power of Habit, which is kind of about how the brain is wired to have habits. And, it's a good book, but it was the first book that made me think about that by understanding the works of the human body, we can kind of work with those traits and find ways to improve our life based on them.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
The Departed is my favorite movie. I've seen it far too many times. I've made all my friends watch it. So I think it would have to be that one.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, David, which one would you choose?
Definitely Kanye's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. That's the best hip hop album of all time.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
It's probably that it doesn't really matter if you fail. The only thing that matters is how fast you improve. And that's, I think, once I internalized that takes a lot of the fear away when you're doing new things, that, it's okay to fail. People aren't going to judge you too much for failing as long as you have the right attitude, as long as you don't repeatedly fail at the same thing, as long as you're making progress and coming at things with the right attitude, people will really respect that.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know yet?
After all the years I spent traveling, you really just get to see that people are a lot more similar than we all think. The world is designed to show us our differences. You've got social media and politics and even things like fashions that are all designed to kind of put lines between everyone. But at the end of the day, most people just want the same things. They just want to be happy, be with their friends, family, safe. And so, I think that's something that really can unite people.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Well, one life hack that had a lot of impact was I got into travel hacking back before I started traveling. And, by the time I started traveling, I didn't have a lot of money, but I had a lot of airline points. So I knew if I ended up in some strange corner of the world, I at least had enough points to get me back to my parents' house. Aside from that, I think a really good life hack is just to remember people's names. People's names are their favorite word, and they like to hear them. So if you remember people's names, they'll like hearing it.
Based on your own life experiences and observations, what's the one characteristic that you think best explains how people find success in life?
I think the most successful people in life are the ones who are just not afraid to go against the grain, not afraid to do things that are different than what everyone else is doing. But, that has to be combined with being open to new ideas, not being afraid to kind of challenge the way you're thinking and be willing to change.
And then, David, the final three questions are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is complete the sentence. The thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
The ability to re-engineer the incentives that drive our world.
And this one, complete the sentence. If you're on Twitter, you should be following.
I really like technical explainer threads. And I think Bartek from Maker and L2Beat has some really great threads. Aside from that, Lido Cohen from Hop and Crypto Testers is one of my favorite people in the Ethereum space.
And lastly, complete the sentence. I'm happiest when?
So there's these moments that I've gotten when I'm traveling sometimes when it's usually in really mundane situations, but in really remote corners of the world. And I just get struck by kind of the awe of the world, how crazy the world is and how lucky we are to get to experience the weirdness of living on planet Earth. Those moments are by far the happiest that I can feel.
The GRT IQ 10.
After this,
I show you how deep the rabbit hole.
David Mihal, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me today. This interview has been a long time in the making, but you've been very generous and I appreciate your time. If listeners want to learn more about you and follow your work, what's the best way to stay in touch?
You can follow me. It's DMihal. That's DMIHAL on Twitter. And if you're interested in CryptoStats, come check out CryptoStats.community.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRTIQ Podcast. Roger that.